Hello and welcome, Exiles. Today I want to talk about Righteous Fire, specifically about Elementalists. I've gone through a lot of different phases of trying out different ascendancies for RF, and there's a lot of pros and cons to them. And I gotta say, after my test run tomorrow, I'm confident Elementalist is the best, bar none, for League start, campaign, probably to 2 Void Stones. And I'd probably die on that hill. What I experienced yesterday in terms of a League start RF, I've done a lot of League Start RF tests that it just wasn't close. It was so much better than anything else I've ever tried in a League Start SSF setting. And it was just phenomenal. Obviously, everybody knows by now, golems are very, very strong for a dot build especially. And RF falls under that category as a dot character. For reference, I did a run yesterday, which I got the campaign done in 3 hours and 35 minutes, all passive points and Merc Lab included. For me, that's pretty fast. Obviously, for speedrunner standards, speedrunners can do the campaign in 2 hours, something like that nowadays, or under 3 hours consistently. But for me, 3:35 was a new PB. Previously, my fastest time was just barely sub 4, and that was with doing a lot of practice runs prior. The fun thing about this run today was I had not been doing practice runs through the campaign in any recent, setup to this. I just said, today we're going to do a campaign run with RF Elementalist and see how it feels. And it destroyed my previous numbers. For context, when I'd logged back into PoE 2, back into PoE 1 from PoE 2, this run right here, I ran as a chieftain, and it took me from an hour 20 to about 7:30 to get to the point where I was finishing. That's a huge difference. That's almost double the time. Now, granted, this includes if I stopped to eat some food or something like that, if I AFK'd at all. This includes the fact that I was literally just logging in today to play PoE 1, whereas the previous day I'd been playing PoE 2 for about a month straight. So I was out of practice of PoE 1. So you got to factor that in to some extent. But for me, Righteous Fire runs had always been close to around 5 hours if I had some prep time or some practice or had recently played the game. And this one was no practice going into it, and I hit a new PB. And I can't think it has to do with anything other than the fact the Witch Elementalist RF start is very insane. It has to do with the fact you click the Lightning Golem, you get 30% attack and cast speed. That means everything you do throughout your run is more fluid. You get the Flame Golem, it gives you AoE. That means you're killing more things as you go by. And that means you can progress a bit faster because you're getting that XP more consistently, even if you're just running past things. The Chaos Golem, very big dot multiplier, gives you a lot more single target. Flame Golem also gives you % damage, which gives you more single target, and that single target means you get through the bosses faster. And then Stone Golem allows you to be a little bit more lenient with your regen investment. If you've ever done an RF run, you'll know there's a point around normal lab after you get the Fire Mastery where you're starting to feel like I need more regen than I have right currently, and I have to go invest into points into it, which means you're not investing into more damage or more speed or more survivability. You're solely investing into recovery, which is, I guess, is to some extent survivability. But the point is, this Stone Golem node will carry you through the entire campaign. And I didn't feel like I had to go force in some recovery right away to try to fix a band-aid of the part where you start degenning, where normally if you just have the Fire Mastery and most other ascendancies don't provide some initial regen, that is something that you'll run into. So that kind of felt just crazy altogether. But I would take it a step further in that I think its late game potential has a strong argument to compete with some of the best late game scalers. Now, when it comes to campaign, early game, life-based, I previously, before yesterday, thought it could be a toss-up between Elementalist and Chieftain. I don't think it's a toss-up. After playing this, and I played the Chieftain run 3 weeks ago, where I did Chieftain RF. I did this all the way until I was level 85, 90-ish. But from these two experiences, I don't think it's comparable. Now, that being said, it's not just about your Void Stone or your initial 2 stones. It's about how does it scale when you start trying to push this into harder content. T17s, Uber Elder, Maven, the Guardian rotations, and to Ubers. And to that, I gotta be honest with you, I think Elementalist might have what it takes thanks to the changes. And I'm gonna go over why. So currently, outside of Elementalist, before Elementalist got all these changes, and I'm going to talk about Occultist getting changes because it's relevant later, there were, in my mind, two very good late game options if you want to take an RF to the very end game. And those options were a Guardian or a Scion for late game scaling. Chieftain can do okay up to the point of Ubers, and then it kind of falls off in terms of survivability. Life scaling can only get you so far in that regard, whereas Guardian and Scion can way outscale it just because ES gear gets a little bit stupid. I think it's very clear a lot of people are seeing that nowadays. But the point is, with a Guardian, you would use the low life mod from Esh. This is an Esh mod. You can transfer it onto a Twilight Regalia. It allows you to have a bunch of rare gear, and you just make sure your reservation is just above low life, which means you can have all this good rare gear. You can have your mana pool, which then gets reserved to give you a bunch of ES, and you have a character that ends up being very, very tank centric. It has pretty much all of its nodes that are giving you tank power within them. Radiant Faith is, hey, that's more ES. Time of Need, hey, that's more regen. Bastion of Hope, hey, that's more block. This node previously gave recovery at one point. Now it gives just full on reservation. But for the most part, these are generally, I would say, it's a huge defensive ascendancy. Now it even has the Harmony of Purpose, which can be decent in this scenario. So you have some options there, but most of them are defensive in nature. So this ended up being what I would think is the tankiest option. And then Scion was a character that would go full into strength ivory tower investment, and it would end up with a crap ton of AoE, and B, also probably the best damage scaling, was a full strength to ivory tower conversion scaling. Personally, the way I see it when I'm looking at these two, I probably like the Scion the most because this can give you the ability to have consistent chain explodes, definitely better than the Guardian can do it because of the AoE scaling. But Guardian can end up doing it just via how stupid and ridiculous Simplex can get. It can make your int give you enough generic damage where Oriath is chain exploding even if you don't have quite as much AoE explosions. It won't do it as effectively as Scion, but they both can get to that point. So the big difference here is this Ascendancy, very, very defensive focused. This setup, way more offensively focused, and it has the weak point of you are going to be in cull range. So certain mechanics like Expedition, they're not great if you're playing a ivory tower angle because you're reserving down your life. Now, how do I think Elementalists can compete with either of those options? With both get some very large ES late game numbers. Both can probably get around 50k for either of these options. And the way I think the Elementalist gets there is because of the changes they made to Liege of the Primordial, Stone Golem, and Vile Bastion. Previously, Witch didn't really have an access point to a bunch of extra energy shield that helps it keep up with some of these other options. And I still don't think it keeps up with quite as much ES scaling as like a Guardian gets stealing Sanctuary of Thought, or necessarily with the Scion's Ivory Tower, but it's closer, way closer than it used to be, because that Stone Golem gives you close to like 60 to 100% increased defense, and Vile Bastion gives you close to 75% ES as well, and that actually adds up quite a bit. And the reason I am saying this is because I have an example in game. Now, this character is super high end. To be clear, this is just showcasing late game scaling, but the point I'm trying to make here is this is a Necromancer, and this Necromancer has 44,000 ES. That is a ridiculous number. Without something like Sanctuary of Thought, without something like Radiant Faith, without the Ivory Tower scaling, rare gear has gotten so good, and this is one of those questions where I'm going to ask, is GGG going to nerf ES? I don't know. I would think they would at some point, but who knows? Maybe ES will just keep being somewhat ridiculous. We'll see if they do some character balance. But as it stands right now, pre the patch notes, maybe they will address this in the patch notes, but rare gear is so efficient, and percent ES scaling you can get from the Witch, you can actually get quite a decent amount. And I don't think, did this character have Vile Bastion in it? I did have Vile Bastion in this. So I had one of the two ES sources you can get within Witch. Obviously, if you're an Elementalist, you can get that Stone Golem plus the Vile Bastion, and then you have both sources. But just wanted to showcase a reference of good ES gear on something like a Witch can get to those 40, 50k numbers if you're really trying to push it. So my thought process is, if the Elementalist could push those sorts of ES numbers while also getting a decent amount of damage via gear on, or via the damage on gear, how does its ascendancy stack up? And what I'm coming away with, it just has ridiculous damage scaling. So you get the dot multi, the percent damage, the AoE scaling, all that sort of good stuff from the golems, the quality of life of the lightning golem. You get all this quality of life package, and then on top of that, you can easily get a 50% shock in your build, which is a huge damage multiplier that these other classes do not have quite the access to. Cyan can get a little bit of it with the Elementalist node, but it's much harder to get that shock scaling anywhere close to 50, whereas this, it's pretty built into almost just using an Awaken Unbound on a skill and you're almost there. Another thing you get from Elementalist that I think is very unique and quite useful is you get Shaper of Flames. This allows for the situation where no matter what explosion damage type you have, you can then scale it via your fire damage scaling, because the Ignite can work with it, and then you can prolift. One of the ways the Elementalist, or sorry, not Elementalist, Cyan gets Chain Explode is via the Oriath's End, and having just so much generic AoE and so much generic damage that even when it's a cold or lightning explosion, it still will kill the monsters next to it and it'll Chain Explode. However, the Elementalist now can take those, even if it doesn't have enough generic damage scaling, and then convert it all into what it's focusing on, which is damage over time, fire, Ignite, and make those Chain Explodes prolifts work. So it has very good enabling there. And then last but not least, Mastermind Discord, just a very big minus res to enemy node. That's good scaling. So overall, I'm looking at this package and I think it's actually got some pretty good late game potential. So I say all this to say, Elemental seems pretty good to me. We'll see what the patch notes does. This would be probably pretty high up there on the list of builds I want to consider league starting. Obviously, when it comes to league starts, it really just depends what they give us, and I am a sucker for trying some of whatever they change that's new. Last league I did Elementals because it got a bunch of overhaul reworks and I had a ton of fun, which is part of why I'm considering it again. The league before that, they did a big rework for Settlers League. They did a big rework to Berserker, so I said I'm going to do Berserker slams with it, and we'll see. Maybe this patch notes will change some other things that looks new and exciting or looks strong, and I'll want to do that. But for right now, this is definitely a top contender for me with the Blighted Contagion Hyro. And I went ahead and I made a whole bunch of leveling trees in case you're curious to try out to see what you think of Elementalist yourself. And the tree goes all the way from the league start when you go basically bum rush to the nearest Fire Mastery, get the regen node, craft some fire res on gear, and you can start RF from this point. Then it says, hey, at the early levels, you're just going to do a little bit of respecs. Point, unspec these points. Point, unspec these spell damage points. Spell damage does not apply to Righteous Fire. It would apply to your Scorching Ray, but I don't think these points are quite worth it. And then you can swap them out for these percent damage nodes here, which are quite a bit more efficient because they apply to both Scorching Ray and RF. That's the sort of idea. And then I'm branching out, getting the Golem nodes. You get them to level 34. So the one thing about Elementalist League Start is golems are required level 34, which means you just have to do your normal lab a little bit later than you might want to. Maybe you want to do it right away in Act 3, but you don't get golems till Act 4, so you just level up a little bit more. Once you get the golem node plus this, you grab yourself a stone, a chaos, a flame, and a lightning golem, and you are off to the races. From that point on, you are just going to be smashing things. Now, one thing that I would like to say is this tree right here is the tree for my campaign run. After doing this run, I did have a little bit of revisions of things I think would work well, specifically in that I looked a bit at Reservation and the idea of doing Eldritch Battery. So Eldritch Battery is 3 points away, and I looked into it a bit, and I thought, you know what? Static Blows gives 30% damage, 50% duration on shock, and it'll take us from about a 40 shock, which is what we had in the campaign, all the way up to the capped 50% shock, with the late game option of if we can get more shock effect, maybe we can go for that 15 shock later on in character progression to go all the way up to 65 shock would be pretty cool. But this right here allows you to get full Reservation if you do 3 25s and 150% aura in combination with this, and then you have the Eldritch Battery sustain your ES pool. That's the thought process. It doesn't work if you don't have ES gear, so it just depends as you're going through the campaign. Usually you end up picking up some ES pieces in order to get your 4-link RF and your 4-link Scorching Ray. So that's the thought process. You have a little bit of ES gear, and it'll pay for reserving the 3 defensive 25s I really like, Tempest, Arctic, and Flesh and Stone, and then a 50% reservation like a Purity of Elements or Determination or Malevolence. Purity of Elements, you're just trying to fix your res. Once you got your res fixed, you can go Malevolence for damage, or you could lean into determination for some armor scaling. Obviously, if you go into determination, you'd want to spec some more points towards armor on your tree. You don't just want to go into determination with no armor scaling. Right now, this tree does not have armor scaling on it. So you'd want to start looking at nodes like Sanctify. You'd want to start looking at nodes like Juggernaut. You'd want to start looking at nodes like Combat Stamina. There'd be a bit of reprioritization of where you're specing some of your passives, depending if you wanted to go more defensive with it. So that's kind of the one basic change I had to the tree between what I leveled with and what I'd maybe change, is considering that extra pointage for Eldritch Battery and an aura. You can think about it, see if it's worth it to you or not, but it's one way to take advantage of ES that's going to get deleted by Righteous Fire damage anyways. So yeah, that's what the trees are. They're just showing you how I'd level to about 88, which is roughly about the time when you start considering, oh, maybe I want to buy a cluster jewel. Maybe I want to buy a rare jewel. Maybe I want to start getting some of my max res on jewels instead of max res on the tree. The example being, if you want to start looking at clusters, you are close to cluster here, here, and here. Something you would consider dropping is probably this section of the tree, going outside pathing. That's one of the progressions the build would make, where you say, okay, I don't need max res from this anymore. I got max res on a bunch of jewels, and you start getting a lot more DPS that way. That's just one of the natural progressions, swapping from just your tree power to cluster power, stuff like that. That's the idea. Hopefully this gives you a good look into Righteous Fire if you were going to consider league starting it or wanted to do some test runs with it. That's what this tree is for those of you that want to do a test run with RF and want a progression tree, as well as the fact that I just think Elementalist looks pretty good for an RF league start, and it's definitely one of my top contenders. We'll see what patch notes gives us. I mean, if patch notes says Elemental is dead, rest in peace, or if patch notes says, hey, there's some really cool things we've added that you can have access to, that might synergize well with a build like that, it's something to consider. Just one of the builds I wanted to test before the patch notes go live, something that I would have a fairly good idea of how it works, and we'll probably judge it on what changes happens with the patch notes. Anyways, hope you guys enjoyed the video. As always, thanks for watching, Exiles. Take care and peace out. Have a good one.